Erev Tov and welcome everyone. So tonight's class is not only extremely important for the Jewish people as a general question, but there's a lot of passion behind it, controversy. So in short, the question, who is the Mashiach and when is he arriving, is a descendant of David and any second now. That's really the entire class, but we're going to dig in a little bit more. Now, the reality is that this topic is so big that at least an entire other religion was born out of Judaism, connected to this very question about who the Mashiach is. And we'll talk a little bit about, in fact, the very first source. What does that word Mashiach even mean? Many people in English transliterate it as Messiah. And everyone's muted, but I was going to say 10 points to anyone who knows how to say Mashiach in Greek, which I believe is Christos. And that might sound familiar because for Christianity, they call him Jesus Christos, basically the Mashiach one. But what does the word Mashiach actually mean? So what we're going to do tonight is, since we can't look at everything because there's just so much, we're going to try and hit on some highlights to give us a general way of, or a general idea of how classical Jewish sources have understood what the Messiah is, who he is, and even some sources about when the Mashiach will come. Now, of course, there's so much controversy and debate and different understandings, and I will try and mention some of the big issues, including some of even the academic questions, but I want to give people a taste of what's kind of the classical understanding and where do people get that idea from. So Tamar, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And the first question is literally the word itself, Mashiach. What is it? And one of the earliest uses of it, not necessarily the first time we ever see this word, but the earliest use in the context of the Messiah as we think, you can see here in the first book of Samuel of Shmuel, and it's talking about King David, which, as we'll see, is extremely important to who the Mashiach will be. So Tamar, go ahead.
So they sent and brought him David. He was ruddy cheeked, bright eyes, and handsome. And the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord gripped David from that day on.
Excellent, thank you. So Tamar, as a Hebrew speaker, you could probably have read the Hebrew, but the key phrase here is that when the prophet Shmuel, who the people, he was, one of the few people that the Israelites kind of recognized as a leader, not quite central, but everyone knew he was special. They turned to him and said, "We want a king like everybody else." This is after the period of the judges, which were basically, tribal warlords. Basically what the judges were, tribal warlords, and you had Samson over here, Dvorah over here, etc. It was, a mixture of chaos fighting the Philistines, etc. And they said, we need a king to rule all of us, at least in the southern kingdom. And Shmuel said, you don't want a king, it's going to backfire. And as a prophet, turned out he was right. But there became this custom, and we're not 100% sure in traditional sources or even academic scholarly sources about something called anointing. In the Hebrew, it says, Vayikach Shmuel et Keren Hashem, and he took this horn of oil, Vayimshach Oto, and he anointed him. He literally poured oil on David. Now, there's different sources about, did he literally just pour a cup of oil on his head, or did he pour oil in his hand and make a smear, kind of like in the beginning of The Lion King? A lot of different interpretations, but this idea of using oil to mark somebody for a significant position, whether it's king or later the position of the high priest, this idea of anointing someone for a high position, we're not sure where it came from, but that became an accepted practice, that a person of high stature is marked with oil. That's it. This has nothing to do with resurrection of the dead, about the future of mankind. The word Mashiach is just somebody who is of a significant leadership position, and you pour oil on their head. And I believe other cultures probably around the time had a similar practice as well. Now, that means it's very important. You don't just pour oil on people's heads for no reason. They may pour oil on their arms for medical reasons, or it feels nice, kind of like a moisturizer. But specifically, to yimshach somebody is somebody significant, a leader. And how was David marked as a leader? Even before the people accepted him. How do we know he was king? You pour oil on his head. So the simplest understanding of Mashiach is somebody who is marked to be a great leader. So putting aside all the supernatural stuff that we'll get to in the future prophecies and everything, Mashiach just means one who has been anointed. That's the simplest understanding of Mashiach. However, King David, became the king who united the southern and the northern kingdoms. Great, we go on for hundreds and hundreds of years, beautiful. And then his son takes over, Solomon. And then after Solomon, the kingdom split, chaos, etc. The northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrians. The southern is conquered by the Babylonians. Shrinking history, and eventually the two kingdoms of Israel fall. And we are living in very, very dark times. And people are looking to get our kingdom back, go back to the land of Israel. And they're praying for a leader, for a king to bring them back. And what happens is the prophets and writers, and we'll see this inside, but essentially what happens is all these prophets say, one day we'll get our kingdoms back. We'll leave Babylon. We will get the kingdom of Israel back. And somebody who's descended from the line of David will rule us again. So that's step two. Mashiach, step one is anointing, if you're a king or a high priest. Step two is, after the northern and southern kingdoms are conquered, the prophets say, we will get our kingdom back, which we do. Under the Persians, under Cyrus, we get our kingdoms back. And there's actually a lot of controversy over kings who are not descended from David. And one of the reasons David is so important is the book of Bereshit, of Genesis, says that the king of Israel, the royal scepter, this is Yaakov, one of his final prophecies to his son, says that the leader of the Jewish people, the Israelites, will always be from the house of Judah. David is a descendant from the house of Judah. Why was he specifically the one who the king would descend from? There's not a clear answer for that, except he was the best king that people ever knew. He united the two countries, or the northern and southern kingdom. So that's the political understanding of what happened in the prophet saying, why would someone descended from David rule us again? So when did it become this supernatural prophecy for thousands of years down the line? That's what we're going to get into now. So Gloria and Leonard, I see you have a question as well. So as soon as you unmute, you can hit your question. Yeah, Gloria, please.
In the paragraph that we just read in the Hebrew, there are some strange marks, like the next to the bottom full line. Hashemen has that triangle over it.
Oh, this is all those notes are the trope for how to recite it, which the actual significance of the trope is they're basically punctuation. So certain trope are the equivalent of a comma, or the equivalent of this word has emotional significance. It's actually, once one reading the trope is one thing, understanding the significance of each trope and what it's trying to do in terms of how to recite it or sing it adds a lot of layers to the text. But that's what it is. It's just it's the trope. Excellent. So the second section here, actually just section A, we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit and talking about how important this belief in the Mashiach is. You know what? We're actually going to come back to section A later. I think it's better to go to section B. So the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom. And again, historically, we split into two kingdoms, a lot of civil war. Again, it wasn't since King David that our kingdoms were united, which is why King David is the, blanking on the word right now, but, when people look back at times with, with rose-colored glasses, with nostalgia, we're nostalgic for the times of King David because the kingdoms were united, all the tribes were united, things were great. Nothing's ever perfect. Pretty good under David. But then the Assyrians conquered the north, the Babylonians, who conquered the Assyrians, then conquered the south. They exile a huge number of our people, all of the, the leaders, etc., to Babylon. And now the prophet Isaiah is living amongst these times, the people who are broken and defeated, the people who believe that God would protect us, who remember the days of being a mighty kingdom, and now we're a broken, scattered people. Will we always be this way? And the prophet Isaiah, there's actually two parts to his book. The first part is more focusing on what happened, how did we get into this? And the answer is, you, the people, messed up in sin. And the second half says, but don't worry, there's an end to this. But in chapter 11 is one of the most famous prophecies of the book of Isaiah that directly, it's one of the main sources for who and what the Messiah is. So please, Gloria.
And it shall come to pass on that day that the descendant of Yishai, that is the Mashiach, who stands as a banner for the people, to him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. And it shall come to pass that on that day the Lord shall continue to apply his hand a second time to acquire the rest of his people that will remain from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Samaria and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. And he shall raise a banner to the nations, and he shall gather the lost of Israel and the scattered ones of Judah. He shall gather from the four corners of the earth.
Excellent. So again, this is one of the main sources for when we talk about Mashiach, what do we mean? And there's a couple very important things to get out of here. One is, it doesn't actually say a descendant of David, it says a descendant of Yishai, who was David's father. There could be a number of reasons for that. I'm sure there's many commentaries. One practical one is that once you get to David's line, there's a lot of intrigue and infighting about who the true descendants are and take over. But if you say from Yishai, anyone who's descended from Yishai will be like a pure blood brother descendant of David. So lots of questions there about that, but focus here. So somebody who's a descendant who's related directly to David, which also means the tribe of Judah. And again, when Bereshit says the leaders of Israel will come from the tribe of Judah, the understanding becomes not just any Judite, which is probably most of us, but specifically from the line of David, who God chose. God chose among the sons of Yishai, Jesse, and that it would be David. So that's one. We established that. The second thing here is that he's going to bring all the exiles back. Makes a lot of sense. Everyone's in exile. A king, a descendant from the king that you all know and love from a generation, many generations before. It's been a long time now because you've been suffering through horrible kings, corrupt kings, and David is a past memory of, perfect days. But we'll go back to the days of David. He'll bring you all home. And all of the other nations, and this isn't just he'll murder and destroy all the other nations, it's when he comes back to Israel, all of the other nations are essentially, it doesn't say this, but they're all basically going to bow down and make peace with Israel. That'll come out more in other prophecies and later texts, but when David comes home, we will be a mighty nation again. We will get the respect of everyone that we deserve. Now, Isaiah does say more things about the temple and God's presence, and the other prophets talk about a day of the Lord and the whole world recognizing God. But ultimately, exiled, broken people, you'll come home and we'll be a mighty nation again. That's what the Mashiach. Nothing supernatural and nothing that's too difficult to believe. And you don't even need to say that this prophecy is supernatural. It's, this is very possible to give hope to a broken, exiled people that you get to come home and we will be a mighty nation again. And by the way, he's mostly right. They do get to come home. Do they become the mighty nation they once were? Not quite, but they do get to come back and rebuild the second temple. Wasn't as good as before, but that's, the issue with nostalgia and our memories. But one of the interesting things here is when Isaiah talks about coming back, he's talking to the generation that's living in his time. He's not talking about 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years or even 400 years. He's talking about maybe a few decades later. So one of the biggest questions about the book of Isaiah is, who is he talking about in his prophecies? And it is way, way more likely he's talking about a king who might even be alive, who might even be born at that time, just a child. And it's very, very likely that Isaiah is indeed talking about someone who's already born, who's maybe in hiding or in Babylon. And, he's saying this guy is going to be the leader that's going to bring us home. It's much less likely that he's saying in 2,000 years from now, there's going to be a mystical king that will rise up. And one of the reasons that it makes more sense that he's talking about the time is not only the text itself, but it also makes sense because he's talking to the people there who are suffering. And this is what they need to hear. And that's what happens. The people do go out of exile. So how do we get from Isaiah talking about something that's going to happen in their lifetime, or maybe the next generation, 70 years, whatever, to a prophecy that will happen 2,000 years later. And there's not one good answer for that, but one possibility is that when we got exiled again by the Romans, people went back at the text and said, God said we would come home, we would be a mighty nation. Well, we got kicked out pretty quickly. So maybe Isaiah's prophecy didn't actually come true yet. And Isaiah was the greatest prophet ever. So if he said a descendant of David was going to take us home and we'd be a mighty nation again, and the Romans just kicked us out after a few hundred years, then you know what? I don't think the prophecy has come true. So again, I'm kind of condensing a lot of scholarship and a lot of history, but you can see how the prophecy of Isaiah doesn't seem to have come true. He promised we would be home and we'd be mighty. So when we came home for the second temple, that was a fake. It's like fake winter in Milwaukee. You thought winter, or fake summer. You thought it's summer. Nope, it's still really winter. It was just a joke. So I'm going to pause there before we go on to the next sources and ask if there are any questions up until now. Beautiful. And just what I've tried to pack into just this one source here is kind of the whole history of the Mashiach, which is, again, it started as a political thing, speaking to a broken, exiled people. And while the prophecy probably was about that moment in time, the people felt later that it wasn't fulfilled. Now, at some point in history, you have obviously the Christians who read it not totally differently. They read it again as somebody's going to come, a descendant of David, and save us and bring us home. So they think Jesus is the guy. And by the way, maybe, as we'll see later, it can't be, still can't be, and you're for obvious reasons. But yeah, Leon, you're actually not muted. So go ahead, Leon, please.
The question I have, though, is that didn't Isaiah live during the time of the kingdom of Judah, of Yehudah? And so how are people scattered? The people weren't scattered. There was a kingdom there.
But he saw it fall. He lived through that time.
He did his own time then.
No, well, there's a couple of things. One is he's a prophet, but he was also seeing the fall. He saw the war with the Babylonians.
Are we talking about Isaiah? Or we're talking about Jeremiah.
We're talking about sorry. Yeah. Well, so Jeremiah lived through it.
Jeremiah lived during the Babylonian conquest, but Isaiah lived a few generations before that, I thought.
He saw, well, so this is one of the interesting questions. Now, he definitely saw the fall of the northern kingdom, and he knew that the right. So this is, I guess I'll step back a little bit. Prophets, while they are seeing visions from God, their main thing is not to tell the future, it's to read the writing on the wall. And what Isaiah and Jeremiah also see, and Ezekiel as well, is they see what is coming. They know it's coming. And in fact, Jeremiah, who's literally alive while the southern kingdom is falling, recognizes immediately that we are going to fall. So Jeremiah basically says, give in, because the only way we can survive is to surrender. People don't like that message. And Isaiah sees it coming. So excellent question. But a point, again, is that Isaiah recognizes that they're going to fall, but he believes that they will rise once again. Does that help answer your question? And this is where it gets tricky. And if you want to bring in different scholarship and people who question the authenticity of it, there are different answers that could help explain it. That's not the perspective we're going in here. Our perspective is that we're taking the text as it is written and how it's understood traditionally. And I think there's a compromise view there, ways to make the text work with what we know about history. But I think that's the best thing there is Isaiah saw the writing on the wall, and then that prophecy was continued by Jeremiah, et cetera. But Isaiah absolutely saw the fall of the northern kingdom. And that's the biggest thing. He wasn't just saying, southern kingdom, we just fell, we'll come back. He saw the fall of half of our people. And he was talking about a future kingdom when everybody would come home under one united king, King David. So excellent question, Leon. Beautiful. So Leonard, this next source here, and we don't even need to go into this next one. Essentially, just jumping ahead to the 16th century, you have the Portuguese rabbi, or from Portugal, I missed an O there, and he just emphasizes how much tradition has said that the Mashiach will absolutely be a descendant of David, to the point where it will literally be David resurrected. But again, we go back to a time when the kings were united and strong. And if you want to say, how and why did the Mashiach become what the Mashiach is, the one word answer is hope. Hope. Why did we even need this concept of a Mashiach? And again, the word Mashiach was literally just whoever the leader is, oil on their head. But the idea that one day a great leader would come to bring us all together, we needed that hope. And again, in some ways, that prophecy came true in the times of the Second Temple. People want to argue it might even be happening today, but that's essentially a broken people needed hope. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Yechezkel, and really the other prophets gave us that hope in the guise of Mashiach. So again, there's so much more, but in this 1 foot answer, where did the idea of the Mashiach come from? After we were a broken people, we believed that God would give us a leader to bring us back to our mightiness under King David. But again, all that other supernatural stuff that's hard to wrap our heads around, that was not necessarily there. And one of the challenges is in the books of Isaiah and in the books of Yechezkel, when it talks about a future time and the dry bones will rise up again, did the prophets literally mean that supernatural things would happen? Or was it metaphorical that we as a people would gain our strength back again? Now, I'm not going to dig into that. I'm not going to go into what was meant to be taken literally and what was meant to be taken metaphorically. It's clear that all the prophets agree that one great leader would rise up and bring us home and back to our mightiness. What other supernatural things would happen? That basically we'll see. And that's actually a debate. That's a whole other class I have about what will happen in the times of the Mashiach. What will the end of times look like? But that's Mashiach in a nutshell. Again, from Mashiach literally just being any anointed, oiled leader to after we were broken is the prophet saying, we have hope, we will come back again. And they were really talking about that time. And then when we were destroyed again by the Romans and exiled, that hope did not leave us, became more powerful than ever. And people said, no, 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 no. The prophecy was not for hundreds of years ago. The prophecy hasn't fully come true yet. And unfortunately, you see this about a lot of people who say the end of times is coming in 2015. And 2015 comes. And it's not the end of times. And we're actually going to see a source that says exactly that issue about when we should expect the Mashiach. But that is essentially where the Mashiach, why we need to believe in a Mashiach and the importance of the Jewish people. So any questions up until now? Excellent. So Leonard, this next source here is really fun. The original name for this class is On a White Donkey. One of the most famous prophecies about the Mashiach, which comes from one of the prophets, actually from 2 of the prophets, is how we're going to know that it's the Mashiach. Because what if I say, I'm probably from the tribe of Judah. Let's say I'm descended from David. So Lake Park Synagogue, I'm the Mashiach. Pour oil on my head. Everybody, let's go to Israel. How do you know it's me? We are going to see a source a little bit later down, how you might know who's going to be the leader. But one of the most famous things is what their digs, how they're going to ride into town. Will it be in a Porsche or a Maserati? But instead, Leonard, we have this beautiful tradition. Please.
Rabbi Alexandri says, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi raises a contradiction between 2 depictions of the coming of the Mashiach. It is written, quote, there came with the clouds of heaven one like unto a son of man, and there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom. His dominion is an everlasting dominion.
Pause there before you read. So that's from the book of Daniel, who we actually just had a class of last week. But how's he going to come in? He's going to come in riding on?
Donkey.
Oh, no. Before that, the book of Daniel said he's going to come riding on clouds of heaven. He's going to come flying in on magical clouds.
Clouds.
That's version 1 from the book of Daniel, who's actually writing what Daniel is writing during the time of the Persians, like right before the book of Esther happens. This is actually when the Second Temple is being rebuilt. But again, we still don't have it. And this actually goes back to Leon's question is, how can you be writing about the Mashiach coming when we're back in the land of Israel and we even have the Second Temple or rebuilding under Ezra and Nehemiah, et cetera, like that. And it's not just about we're, on the other side of the world. It's not just about being in Israel. It's about having a unified Israel where everyone recognizes God. And it's just like the Israel we want. So some people today will say, yes, we're living in the land of Israel. That's step 1. We're not at step 2 or 10, whatever. So you have to take, and they talk about this in the Talmud, these little baby steps towards the Mashiach. And there's a source I didn't bring about we're going to have a pre-Mashiach, someone who's going to come and they're going to do some things. And, Mashiach ben Yosef, who's a descendant of Yosef, and he's going to come and do X, Y, and Z. And once he comes, we'll know that, the Messiah descended from David, who's going to rebuild the temple and unite the nations and bring all Jews home. He's coming next. But there's little baby steps. So the book of Daniel, again, he's in the land of Israel, but we're not there yet. So he says he'll fly in on clouds. But Leonard, Zechariah, what does he say? And it is written.
And it is written, behold, your king will come to you. He is just and victorious, lowly and riding upon a donkey, and upon a colt, the foal of a donkey.
So we have a debate here. So is the Mashiach coming on clouds or is he coming on a donkey? If you have a donkey up in the clouds, it'll fall through. So which one is it? And this is actually this really is a debate between these two texts. But the rabbis actually have a beautiful way to resolve the two texts. So please, Rabbi Alexandria explains.
Rabbi Alexandria explains, if the Jewish people merit redemption, the Mashiach will come in a miraculous manner with the clouds of heaven. If they do not merit redemption, the Mashiach will come lowly and riding upon a donkey. King Shapur of Persia said to Shmuel mockingly, you say that the Mashiach will come on a donkey. I will send him the riding horse that I have. Shmuel said to him, do you have a horse with 1,000 colors, like the donkey of the Mashiach? Certainly his donkey will be miraculous.
So the way the rabbis resolve this, and again, I'm sure there's a million ways, both textually and historically and scholarly to resolve, but they say, look, if the Jewish people earn the Mashiach by doing good deeds, and that's actually a debate today, what's going to bring the Mashiach? All of us doing mitzvot and being good people, or we're going to be so bad and sinful that God is going to say, ugh, it's enough already, I'm going to step in. It's like two kids fighting. You want them to resolve it themselves, but sometimes you just got to get involved and break up the fight. So if they earn it, send in the Mashiach on beautiful clouds. But if they don't earn it, then he'll come on a donkey. But look, he's still the Mashiach. So his donkey is going to have fenders and an engine and sparkles and like a unicorn, etc., like that. But it's a beautiful image. But it is this idea that there's multiple ways of understanding how the Mashiach will be revealed to us. And one thing I didn't talk about is, again, if Isaiah was talking about a king will rise, descended from King David, who will lead us back into victory. And then that king will be anointed. So we'll call him Mashiach. Beautiful. But what if the nation falls? And then 200 years later, another king comes back. Can there be more than one Mashiach? And that's actually a fascinating conversation. All of these prophecies talking about one mystical or even normal person, just one person in history who will finally bring Israel to a point where infinity will be together? Or does it mean that any man, and we should be clear here that the texts are all talking about a man, that's another class about can a woman ever be the leader of the people? But for all of these writers, for them it's a man, it is a king. But when they talk about this man coming back, is it any man who unites the Israelite nation and brings back the exiles and rebuilds the temple and brings back the nation? What if that happens in 2023 and we get back together and it lasts for 400 years and then we're destroyed again? Can we still believe another Mashiach is coming? And that is something that, again, other religions, Christianity kind of, base their, it's not the only thing they based on, but that's a big deal for them. There is one single person called Mashiach, where again, the word Mashiach just means the one who is anointed. Anybody who's a descendant of David could be the king. So we get a king now. He unites the land of Israel, brings peace to the Middle East. Wow, wow, wow. That would be the greatest miracle of all. And then he dies, and that's fine. And his son takes over. So is he the Mashiach too? And the answer is both yes and no, and it depends on how you look at it. Is the Mashiach a single mystical figure that exists once in the history of the universe? Or is it whoever fulfills this role? And there can be multiple Mashiachs. Maybe Yehoshua, who led us into the land of Israel, he was the Mashiach. Again, there's all these, what does it mean to be the leader who brings us in. And there are a lot of people who say that some of the early leaders of Israel, Ben Gurion, who helped bring us into the land of Israel, they were kind of Mashiach. So again, there's multiple different ways of looking at when we say Mashiach. And when people picture Mashiach, they picture, again, this perfect heavenly being, not God, certainly not in Judaism, but this perfect heavenly divine being who comes down on a cloud or on a donkey, and then the end of times happens and we all live in the Garden of Eden. But what if it's just a man who helps unite the people, who helps lead us? They die, someone takes over, and they're Mashiach too. It's whoever fulfills that role of uniting and leading us beautifully. No one has done it yet. But what if the Mashiach is that? And again, that debate exists amongst the rabbis. Some see it less about the man and more about a period of time in human history when the world ends and we are literally in heaven. And some see it as just a man who can unite us. And if that's true, it could happen at any moment. So before we go on to the next section, which was one of my favorite about how do we know who this man is going to be, any questions up until now? Excellent. Elizabeth, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this next section here becomes very, very important. And I actually just brought one source. Leon was mentioning earlier that Rambam in his compilation of Jewish law in the Mishnah Torah writes a great deal about the end of times. Rambam is actually famous for saying that when the Mashiach comes, everything will happen in a natural way. It won't be mystical, magical clouds. It could be a Ben Gurion. It could be any person who just happens to unite our people and bring us into the land of Israel and rebuild the temple. So it could be some rabbi living in Jerusalem right now. So based on a number of Talmudic traditions and sources, Rambam compiles a list and says whoever fulfills this whole list could be the Mashiach. And that's very key. He doesn't say they are the Mashiach. They actually need to unite all the people, bring all the Jews back, rebuild the temple, and fulfill the prophecies of Isaiah and the other prophets. But to even be considered, you have to get on this list. So Elizabeth, go on this list, and everybody kind of have in mind certain men and people in both recent and ancient history who've been suggested as Mashiach, because again, the reality is there are men in history and women as well who probably hit a lot of the notes, as it were, on this list. So go ahead, Elizabeth.
If a king arises from the house of David who is learned in Torah,
Easy.
and is
There have been.
involved-
Oh, sorry. We'll do each one. So the first one, that's not a challenge. There have been plenty of people, and again, the historical figure for Christianity of Yeshua or Yehoshua, who became Jesus in English and Greek, he certainly could have been this. Probably, maybe he was decided from David, and he clearly was a student of Torah. That's not hard. And again, there are rabbis today who are learning in Torah. I'm sure you've all met a rabbi, whether they know it or not, probably a descendant of David, brilliant in Torah. Easy peasy. People on this call may even fulfill that. Excellent. Next one, Elizabeth.
You want me to keep reading?
Yeah, please. And is
Okay.
involved?
And is involved with mitzvot like David, his ancestor.
Easy. Keep going.
According to both the written and the oral Torah.
Excellent. Absolutely not a challenge. We have. I guarantee we have rabbis and men and again probably women as well who easily fulfilled all those. Please continue.
And if he persuades all of Israel to follow the path of Torah and mitzvot and strengthens their observance.
So pause there for a moment. Now this is already where we start getting into the people have tried this, but no one's quite done that. Now there have been rabbis who have certainly fulfilled the first ones, or probably, we can't be 100% sure they're descended from David, people have different traditions, but let's say they fit all the first ones, and they inspired many Jews to come closer to Torah, but to say all of Israel to come back, nobody's done that. Nobody has done that. But let's say we do have somebody who starts a campaign and they absolutely bring back countless Jews to some level of observance. And it says strengthens their observance. It doesn't mean that he makes every Jew in the world totally observant. So again, this is reasonable. And we probably have seen people like this, but already, certainly with Christianity, and this, again, by the way, I want to be very clear, I'm not attacking Christianity. I respect that is their religion, that is their revealed tradition in the world. However, their religion did not bring people closer to the observance of Torah. It brought them further away from it, at least their later writers. So they're out at this point because the lack of kashrut, Shabbat, etc., knocked out of this fight. But we have rabbis who maybe hit on this. Please continue.
And if he fights the wars of God, then he is presumed to be the Mashiach.
Excellent. So what is this wars of God? Is it spiritual? Is it a literal war? So if you look back to in the times of the Romans, Bar Koziba, perhaps is his name before, Rabbi Akiva thought he was Mashiach because he was literally fighting a war against the Romans. And he probably more or less fit these other things. Realistically, I don't know if he was actually a Torah scholar, but let's say he kind of hit the rest of this list. So Bar Kokhba could have been the Mashiach. He was inspiring people to want to rebuild the temple, to fight the Romans. And at that point in history, it probably was possible to find out if he was a descendant of the house of David. So Rabbi Akiva had a good chance here, and this is very key. Presumed he had a becheskat, this strength, this idea, presumption that he could be Mashiach. So again, you've all probably been on a subway or on a train or something with someone who maybe potentially could be Mashiach. But that's only step one. That you could be a candidate for the program. You know, you're not going to be able to play basketball in the NBA if you're 3 feet tall. You know, there's certain kinds of, well, potentially you could. Muggsy Bogues was an amazing jumper. But again, there might be certain requirements before you can even consider yourself for the job. But then you actually have to try out and get the job. And that's where he gets into part two. If he continues, please,
If he
Elizabeth.
continues and is successful and defeats all the surrounding non-Jewish nation and builds the Beit HaMikdash at its location and gathers all the Jews exiled around the world to the land of Israel, then he is certainly Mashiach.
And this is so, so important because the people who have been claimed to be Mashiach in history, our response should be, go for it. Good luck. You know, gesundheit hate. And now the question is, should we literally join up in arms with them? That one is, you know, less clear. Do we spill blood with them? But if there are people who can really, you know, inspire people, and they're clear that they are great leaders, you know, this philosopher king, as it were, that we see in Greek philosophy, and we think they could be great leaders, and they can pull this off, boom, they're Mashiach. Boom, great, no problem. But then he concludes, please, or at least I ended the section here, But
if he did not succeed in all this or was killed, he is definitely not the Mashiach promised in the Torah. And God only appointed him in order to test the masses.
So that's kind of a commentary from Rambam. Why do we have all these fake Mashiachs who don't succeed? Well, he's there to test our faith. So we're not going to unpack that last line there, but it's a very interesting insight from Maimonides. But again, there are many men throughout history who could have been Mashiach, and they got a lot of support, Bar Kokhba, etc., like that, but they died or they were killed. And we should appreciate their attempts, especially the ones who really did bring good to the Jewish people. But if they're dead, okay, we move on. End of story. End of story. And again, Rambam based this on Talmudic sources, and you also just can base it on common sense. When all of the prophecies say this person will unite the nations of Israel. So if you look at someone and say they're absolutely the Messiah, and you say, but the temple's not standing and the Jews are still exiled and there's still people warring with our nation and we're not united, then they're not the Messiah. And again, you don't need to have rabbinic interpretations and metaphors, etc., like that. Somebody has to fulfill the prophecies to be the Mashiach. And again, we're not even getting into the resurrection of the dead and the supernatural components of Mashiach. The basic prophecies that everyone agrees on is the Mashiach will lead our nation, unite us, and rebuild the temple. Everyone agrees on that. No one's done it. Not controversial. I mean, not for the Jews. There have been men who have claimed they could be this. And if they had done it, that would be awesome. We wouldn't need this class. We could be bringing korbanot, sacrifices in the temple. But you know what? They either were killed, or they died, or they simply failed. Or with Shabtai Tzvi, he ended up converting to Islam. And this is one of the challenges that we'll really see in the last section is, what if somebody puts all their faith into this, and specifically into one person, and then they die, or with like Shabtai Tzvi, converts to another religion. And this is unfortunately something we see in other spheres with people with conspiracy theories. I believe with all my faith that some conspiratorial wild thing is going to happen, and then it doesn't. And I can either say I was wrong, I was duped into this, I'm going to go back to my life, Or I just shift my thinking and say, no, 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 it is going to happen, but I'm going to push the date off. Or it is going to happen, but we have to do something different, or I misunderstood it, and everything like that. And that's dangerous because it prevents me from living my life. And again, we'll see that very explicitly in the rabbinic texts about what happens when you put all your faith in Shabtai Tzvi and he converts to Islam. And the Jews are broken and say, that's so sad. We thought we'd finally get Mashiach, but let's go back to living our lives and figuring out Judaism. And then they're the ones who said, no, no, no. When he converted to Islam, which he really did, Shabtai Tzvi did it because he was afraid the Muslim authorities would kill him. Some people thought, oh, we're supposed to secretly convert to Islam and be a secret religion to wait for the Mashiach to come. And that's not logical, rational thinking. And the thing about these prophecies is they're not that complicated. A leader will come up, descended from David, who will inspire, unite us, and bring us together in the land of Israel and rebuild the temple. Not so complicated. No one's done it. And it is absolutely valid for somebody to claim they can do it, to try and do it, to even potentially support someone who's trying to do that if it's clear they have all these other qualifications. And if they fail, we move on. Now, under Bar Kokhba, it cost the lives of hundreds and hundreds of Jews. Under Shabtai Tzvi, it broke the spirit of the Jewish people. In the case of other people, it created a whole new religion that had to redefine what it meant to be the Messiah. But at the end of the day, the prophecies aren't that crazy. It's pretty straightforward, and nobody's done it yet. So before we get into the last section, which I think a lot of people are curious about, is do we have any traditions about when this is going to happen? Any questions up until now? Oh, Elizabeth, I'm sorry, I just muted you. Unmuting you again. And
Yeah.
yes.
I'm gonna try and put this together in my head, but
Sure.
it's almost as though it's nullified, because first it has to be somebody who either comes on a cloud or comes on a donkey's back. But it's not really the right person until you almost have to look backwards over how he's been able to unite the people and get them to be observant. So, how can it be either and both?
So I think this gets a little bit to is the Mashiach somebody who just fulfills the prophecies, or is the Mashiach a mystical figure who is unique in the universe, and they'll have these, basically it's a matter of, will they actually fulfill the prophecies, or will they have these signs that are so unmistakable and mystical and supernatural that of course they're the Mashiach and everything falls into place? And the reality is the answer is both. And if you look at the Kabbalistic text, I skipped over one from the Portuguese Rabbi Abravanel, who said, there'll be a resurrected, literally someone who's resurrected from King David. And there's those traditions that literally clouds will come and lift us up and carry us back to the land of Israel. Now, that exists in our tradition. And there's no way to poo-poo or negate those sources any more than the more rational, logical ones. But again, the texts of Isaiah and the prophets make a lot more sense. And again, still within believing in God and believing in that God will send us a Messiah, to say that it will be a figure who fulfills these prophecies with the support of the people, rather than somebody who comes in, they snap their fingers and the temple falls down full from heaven. But again, you have sources that say that will happen. And when people pray, everybody has a slightly different image in their head of what Mashiach will look like. And within the Jewish world, the idea of Mashiach in general is pretty well accepted, certainly in the believing world. But what the Mashiach will look like, you really have major debates, often represented by Maimonides versus everybody else, often typically Ramban, Nachmanides. But again, are we talking here about a specific mystical figure where we identify them by clouds or donkeys or other mystical things? Or is the thing about a donkey have nothing to do with a donkey? Because most kings do not ride in on a donkey. Most kings ride on a palanquin, a giant throne or a beautiful horse. Well, our king is humble. Our king is a servant of God. And we will know that our leader is not somebody who rides in on an elephant like in the movie Aladdin. Our king is someone who will come in with humility. So again, do you want your Mashiach to be someone who's boisterous and egotistical, or do you want your Mashiach to be this humble, sweet person who all they really care about is helping others? Who would you rather support in either spiritual or even physical battle? So I think, again, it depends on how you read the sources. Do you want a king who comes in with magic and glory and blows us away, or a king who comes in and says that is a true servant of God? And really, you kind of want a little bit of both. We're not going to get behind somebody who literally lives in a dumpster because they think they're so lowly, and nor do you want someone who's so egotistical they live in a palace of gold. You want someone who gives respect and can represent the people, but also someone who knows that they're here to serve the people and to serve God. Does that kind of get to your question a little bit? Ish? Not a little bit, not a little bit. We
I'll
can
leave
come
it at
back to it at the end. It's a tricky question. Excellent. So Leon, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this last section here is, do we have traditions about when Mashiach is coming? Now, again, there are hundreds, if not thousands of texts about when Mashiach is coming, but we're going to go back to some of the earliest sources. Now, if you go to the prophets themselves, Jeremiah, Yechezkel, and Isaiah talk about when the second temple will be rebuilt. So again, when this temple is rebuilt, and we do have a king over Israel, and by the way, in the times of the Greek and Romans, we sort of have kings. They're sort of they're sort of descended from Judah, but they're puppet kings of the Romans. So are they the Mashiach? We're not going to get into that. We're just talking about the rabbinic understanding of whatever king will truly bring us back to a Davidic kingdom. We are united, we are mighty, we are not a puppet kingdom, to the good times. When will that come? And the Talmud does talk about this at length in a few important areas. One of them is in Sanhedrin 97a, and we'll actually see something from this source later again. So please, Leon, from the Talmud, source number one, the school of Eliyahu taught.
The school of Eliyahu taught 6,000 years is the duration of the world. 2,000 of the 6,000 years are characterized by chaos. 2,000 years are characterized by Torah from the era of the patriarchs until the end of the Mishnaic period. And 2,000 years are the period of the coming of the Messiah. That is the course history was to take, but due to our sins, that time frame increased. The Messiah did not come after 4,000 years passed. And furthermore, the years that elapsed since then, which were to have been the Messianic era, have elapsed.
Excellent.
Where do they get this from?
So, I mean, there's a lot of, the reality is that some of this is just traditions where we don't know where they got it from. I mean, the tradition is that it was passed down from Moshe or from earlier sources. Part of it is also the idea of 6,000 years is if you calculate based on reading the Torah, and there's this book of generations, and this is a bigger debate about, there's a lot of assumptions made in counting the lives of the people in the Torah about how old Methuselah was, Methuselah, and his hundreds of years. But there is a way to count it so that you can calculate up when the world was created. And it comes to, thousands of years. But where do they get 6,000 years? And that, again, is a tradition that's not explicit, in the books of the prophets. So we get this tradition of 6,000 years will be the beginning of the end of times. And you have to take a time machine to go back and say, where'd you get that from? However, the tradition is that the world from beginning to end will be 6,000 years broken up into three easy pieces. The times before the Torah, the times of the Torah, which is the time of going to Israel, King David, etc., and the times of the Mishnah, which is in the 2nd and 3rd century Common Era, basically the times of the Romans. And we are living in part 3, which means we're in year 5782. So when we get to, I don't know if anyone here is going to turn themselves into a robot or upload to a computer. Most of us won't make it here, but eventually we'll get to the year 6,000. We're not that far away. When we hit that, and this is what's interesting, no matter what, when we hit 6,000, God will come down and bring the end of times and the Mashiach and everything like that and all those supernatural mystical things. Now, we could have brought it earlier if we were good little girls and boys, but we were not. Now, one of the things you see from the text here is there's a little bit of confusion about, are we at the end of those 6,000 years or are we in the middle of it, et cetera, like that. But basically the tradition is God had a perfect order for the world and we messed it up. So should it have been thousands of years ago, the Mashiach already came. And because we messed it up, instead of the world being 6,000 years old, now it's billions of years old, all kinds of things. But the takeaway from that is that God intended for the Mashiach to come at a specific time in history, but because of the way we have behaved badly through our sins, that's been thrown out. So when we talk about, is there a tradition of when the Mashiach comes? The answer is there was a tradition, but that's thrown out the window. And again, you hear this with conspiratorial groups. When they say something in both ways, you hear people say the end of the world will come in 2000. Well, the world didn't end. Because we were so good and we prepared for it, God spared us. But then you hear, things like God was supposed to save us and bring us to heaven and the aliens and blah, blah, blah. Why didn't that come? Because we didn't deserve it. And again, we'll come back to the idea and why that line of thinking is very dangerous. We absolutely believe God is involved in history and will ultimately bring us to a good place. And we believe in the soul in heaven. But anything, any tradition about a specific time frame for that, we just blown that up completely. So in fact, what I was talking about, the idea that we could speed things up, really comes more here from this source in the Talmud. Ken, I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you. And if you would take this source from the Talmud Bavli Shabbat, go for it, please.
Okay. Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, if only the Jewish people would keep to Shabbatim in accordance with the halakha, then they would immediately be redeemed. As it is said, so said God to the eunuchs who will keep my Shabbos. And it is written after that, and I will bring them to my holy mountain, and I will let them rejoice in my house of prayer.
Excellent, thank you.
So
I don't know if anyone's ever heard this idea before, that if the Jewish people kept 2 Shabbos, Mashiach would come. And I actually put a lot of stock in that, not necessarily as a magic, everybody keeps 2 Shabbos, boom, Garden of Eden. But if you could get every Jew to keep Shabbos twice, the reality is everything up to that point would mean that we basically, Mashiach would be here. And I really mean that. If we could get all the Jews united, we wouldn't need Mashiach. Mashiach would already be here. And I don't say that facetiously. To get the Jewish people to agree on anything requires a whole lot of work. But again, what's interesting here is many, if not all, or certainly the major sources for what the Messiah will be, come from Isaiah. And again, it goes back to the original thing. When we look at Isaiah, he was clearly talking about a leader that would come and reunite both of the kingdoms. But again, the way that he has been understood both by Christianity and later by mystical sources in Judaism, did he really mean that? And I'm not here to challenge it. It's entirely possible that he did mean that. And all of the mystical stuff is absolutely what he intended. But again, it's not clear from the text. It's clear that he believed a man would come and unite the kingdoms. And as far as he's concerned, maybe that did happen and probably did happen in the time of the Second Temple, far from perfectly though. So we believe that will come later. So we keep looking back to the book of Isaiah and saying, we're still waiting for all this to come true. But he is still far and away the main source text for 2 religions as to when, again, the good times and the kingdom Israel and the kingdom of David and the kingdom of God is going to come back.
Sure. I guess.
Yeah, Ken, please.
Sure. I heard about, what he said about the 2 Shabbosim, but why 2? You think 1 would be difficult enough in a nace, a miracle. So, I mean, that he makes it 2, it's like, what is he trying to fudge his bets, safe bet or something like that?
So there's a couple reasons for that. One is the actual verse. Let me see if I can look over if they bring the whole pasuk here. Komar Hashem, the Serisim Asher Yishmeru et Shabtotai. So he talks to the eunuchs, basically like the servants. And he says, if you keep my multiple Shabbatot, and this is actually discussed in the Talmud and the rabbis, whenever something is in plural, what is the smallest number of something that can still be considered plural is?
2.
2. So it doesn't say if you keep Shabbat, it says if you keep my Shabbatot. So again, you could say it means 50, it means 30. You could find other sources. You could do gematria about it and say this actually means 700 Shabbos, et cetera, like that. But they say, so maybe the rabbis here are actually, you say it's hard enough to keep 1 Shabbos. The rabbis are actually being quite lenient here and say the minimum number that we have to keep is 2. But again, realistically, if you get the entire Jewish world to keep 1, again, politically and socially and policy-wise, we would be living in a very different world if every Jew everywhere really kept full Shabbos. But if you could get to that point, 2 Shabbos probably wouldn't be that much of a challenge. And again, for me, and I don't mean this facetiously, that idea of having the Jewish people so unified that they just all keep Shabbos, Mashiach is here already. And again, that's another debate. Will Mashiach come when we've earned it because we're so unified as a people? Or will Mashiach come when we're so broken that someone needs to save us? And by the way, and this is again, for Jews living throughout the Eastern Europe, when anti-Semitism was exploding, Shabtai Tzvi. Why did people so blindly follow a Shabtai Tzvi? Because we were so broken that we didn't think anything could save us. After the Holocaust, people said, we can't go any lower than this. Today, when the truth is, even though the world has not insurmountable, the world has great challenges, but the world overall is better than it's ever been in history. When people look at the Kardashians and the television shows, oh, the world is evil as possible. It is not. But from a certain perspective, the world is as dark and evil as ever. We need Mashiach now. Now, by the way, I do pray for Mashiach, and I do my part to try and help make a world where Mashiach is possible, but different people have a different vision of what will bring Mashiach and what Mashiach will look like. So just this very verse, 2 Shabbatot, I probably understand it differently than perhaps others do. But this next source here is really fun, and it's actually a continuation of the one above, where it talks about this tradition of 6,000, but then we basically messed it up. And Susan, if I could have you read source number 3, please.
Hey, Talmud Bavli, Sanhedrin 97, etc. This is like the practice of Rabbi Zera, who, when he would find sages who were engaging in discussions about the coming of the Mashiach, said to them, please, I ask of you, do not delay his coming by calculating the end of days. As we learn in the Baraita, there are 3 matters that come only by means of diversion of attention from the matter, and these are they, the Mashiach, a lost item, and a scorpion.
Excellent. Do not ask me about those last 2 things. We can go look at Rashi's commentary to explicate the significance of lost items and scorpions, although it's basically like a watched pot never boils. If you're paying attention for it, you'll never see it. But when you stop paying attention, again, that's a very human experience. But what he's saying about the Mashiach is if you are constantly waiting for it, it will seem like it's never going to happen. Just focus on living your life. And we'll see this come out more in the next sources, but don't talk about Mashiach. The point is focus on building a world, on doing mitzvot, on trying to reunite the people, on bringing Mashiach through your deeds, not on sitting around and figuring out the calculations and when we will come. And the reality is a lot of Jews who do pray most fervently and say, bring Mashiach now, they don't really focus on the timing. They focus on what are the deeds? How can we be active and engaged in the world so that Mashiach will come soon? So it's pushing a little bit that focus on Mashiach. If you say Mashiach will come any second, and 20, 30 years later, Mashiach still isn't here, that will lead to the next source. But before I read the last source, I will say that here it says, don't talk about Mashiach. Just don't talk about it. Just live your life. Mashiach will come when God wants him to come. Don't talk about it. Well, what happens for the next page of the Talmud is all they do is talk about Mashiach and when Mashiach will come. So again, you can have in the Talmud, you can have your cake and eat it too. But this final source is so important. And this speaks not only to things I've talked about, people who believe in these end of times things and Nostradamus, etc., but even to us who, and again, I believe in my kishkas in Mashiach, but this really speaks to even those who are faithful and truly believe in it. And again, it's from the continuation from this page in the Talmud on 97. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says, the Rabbi Yonatan says, may those who calculate the end of days be cursed. Those who sit around doing it, that's horrible what they're doing. As they would say, once the end of days that they calculated arrived and the Mashiach did not come, that he will no longer come at all. And I mentioned this earlier. If someone says Mashiach is coming in 1 year from today, and everyone gets all their hopes up, and the Mashiach doesn't come, what happens? Some people say, oh, we did the calculations wrong, or, they come up with excuses, but a lot of people just become disheartened. So if you put all your focus on Mashiach is going to come any second, it's okay, everything that's happening to you, don't worry about anything, Mashiach is coming. And then it keeps going on and on and on. You just kind of lose your heart for anything, not only in your belief in Mashiach, but just even your faith in God potentially. If the prophet of God, Isaiah, Yeshua promised to Mashiach, and we keep promising that he'll come in any second and he doesn't, it's really hard to believe in those prophecies. Whereas if we say it is something that will happen in history when it's meant to happen, and that's the way this source in Talmud ends quite beautifully. Rather, the proper behavior is to continue to wait for his coming, as it is stated, though it tarry, just wait. So why do we await? Why does God want us to sit around waiting? Why can't Mashiach just come right now? So the answer here is we do so in order to receive a reward for awaiting his coming. As it is stated, happy are all those who wait for him. But there's a lot of ways to understand this. Does God just say, if you keep the faith, it'll come? And that is one beautiful way to understand it. Mashiach will come when it's time for Mashiach. And as long as you believe that, then God will reward you. But the other really important thing here is those who are not making up these fake calculations or basing everything on Mashiach coming tomorrow, but rather trusting in God and just living their lives and trying to be the best they can to create a world in which Mashiach makes sense, then that's what God really wants. Not for you to wait for one guy to fix everything, but for you to do your part. And the rabbis say this in Pirkei Avot, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. No one person can fix everything. Everybody has to fix a little bit. And it goes back to the two Shabboses thing. If everybody does imagine, if every Jew in the world decided for one day to give $10 in charity, the number of lives we could save would be massive. If every Jew in the world decided to recycle for one day, 1 week, again, the Jewish people have a power to impact this world. And if we wait for some far off prophecy for someone else to do it for us, maybe it'll come. It'll come eventually, but it's going to be a long time. But if we focus on living in the moment and making this a better world, then the Mashiach will be here before you know it.